All right, good afternoon, everybody. Let's get the Human Resources committee meeting going. All right. Mr. Swirsky, I've got staffing report, and I've got a bunch of placeholders, and then the pay rate sheet, which we approved. Is this just informational at the end there, the pay rate sheet?
It's on there again because there was discussion, we'll say a motion at the last meeting.
Mr. Swirsky, would you put your light on for the people watching on YouTube? Thank you.
There was a motion at the last meeting to bring it forward again for Member Oswald's motion.
Okay. Okay. So let's start at the top then with the staffing report action items. Is there anything that you wanted to highlight, Mr. Swirsky?
Nothing out of the unusual there.
Okay. Member Oswald, is this on the staffing report?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I have two questions. The first one is I noticed under certified appointments, we're hiring a teacher to be specifically homebound and then point for special ed. I was just curious when we started using FTE for homebound. I thought those were like sub-positions.
In the special ed area, we were not having success of finding a special ed homebound teacher. So this was in dealing with the Director of Special Services and that. We combined the two positions to make it benefit eligible.
And so is this for a student or students that are home medically, or is this that they're not able to be successful in school?
Medically.
Okay.
There would be a reason, yes.
Okay. And my second question is on the non-certified permanent decrease and increases. In the titles it says, position / location / week / rate of pay / reason, and no reasons are given. So I was just curious why the reasons are for an increase and a decrease for these two employees.
I'm sorry, can you tell me which area again?
Non-certified permanent decrease and non-certified permanent increase.
So for the permanent decrease, the individual selected another position, and that's how we record those. When they have one position and then they drop in their FTE, he selected a different position on his own. And on the permanent increase, it's the opposite. She selected a position that now got her to be benefit eligible. So,
all right, thank you.
All right, seeing no other questions on the staffing report, let's go to the hourly wage. You've got a placeholder, but this is the hourly. We're talking about the same thing on page 4 and 5, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, I thought that's the updated one. I thought we would include it at the last meeting after some discussion, and Member Oswald had made a motion that there was some discussion that we table that until this meeting and approve what we had for that minimum wage. So this is just bringing that back up again for any other additional discussion.
Member Oswald.
Thank you. I wrote down the motion again so I can refresh everybody's memory. It was to provide a raise percentage equal to the raise given teachers each year for all hourly non-substitute employees remaining in the same hourly position they held the prior year. The first raise will begin August 2018 and continue annually on an employee's anniversary date. It will not be retroactive.
And so one of the questions that came up in this was it was unclear what positions would fall under your proposal compared to what is on this sheet. And I'm wondering if you've done any clarification on that.
My clarification on that was every position listed that was minimum wage, that it does not have substitute after it. It's all regular employees.
Okay. And it would be limited. There isn't anybody outside of the scope of this that would fall into your motion.
My intention was just for this pay rate. I am willing and more than able to modify what I'm asking because I realize it may not be a perfect situation or solution. I did have a conversation with Mr. Swirsky this past week, and he brought up a good point about the other people that aren't minimum wage might be upset. So I offered to perhaps include them in getting the same raise rather than just be minimum wage, have all hourly employees. I asked for the number of employees this would affect, and I don't know if you've made any progress on that. And so,
Mr. Swirsky?
I ran all the minimum wage employees right now, and there's 158 of them. Mm-hmm. Now that I did the maximum exposure that we could have, so that increased them to 15 cents. That was what we approved on this original one. Assuming 12 hours a week and 38 weeks in a school year, that's about $10,800. Now, that's on the high end because I don't believe all of these people are truly working 12 hours a week, but that would be our maximum exposure. Now, I did one other calculation. If we put a 1% increase, which is the teachers, onto that number that I just gave you, that equals approximately another dime, so that brings them up to $975. Again, with the 12 hours and the 38 weeks, that's an additional $7,200.
And I have a clarifying question, if I may, Chair. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Is that there's 158 total employees, but this raise would only affect the people holding the same position. Do you know how many of those people would remain in the same position? And so that's a significantly smaller number from what I am understanding.
What I can't tell you off of what I have is, are they new this year? Did they roll over from last year? Did they move over from another building? Did they drop down from a position back into one of these other positions? I don't have that.
Mr. Swirsky, would that be an administrative headache to track who is remaining in the same position year to year and only apply the increase to that group of people?
It would be a challenge, and we currently are like that right now with our paras, except on their anniversary date, so it doesn't matter where they go, and that has been a challenge for us. So if we're looking at individuals in existing buildings in the same position, and some of these will do playground monitor and cafeteria monitor, unless we look at that all as the same or two different positions, it's are they in the same position technically?
Member Oswald? Mm-hmm. Why not expand your coverage to anybody who remains with the district in whatever position from year to year? Would that be easier administratively to say, okay, somebody who's been here a year, they qualify?
Yes. As we discussed earlier, if you look at, all the positions on this sheet, or are we still talking about minimum wage? Because eventually those minimum wage people are going to
be above minimum wage.
Well, and start passing up the other people who, so.
I had also discusshed, does this need a cap too? I mean, and I know that there are steps and lanes with teachers' contracts and that kind of stuff. Is there, a maximum an employee can reach too? That I'm open to make it however we need to do to make it fit, just to make sure that we value our employees.
So for the sake of today's conversation, I would say maybe if anybody else wants to speak to this, we could do that. I also think that we could take a little bit more time to make this right, and that perhaps you could continue conversations with Mr. Swirsky to make sure if there is a cap, what that cap would be, to come with a more concrete picture before it's made as a motion.
Sure. And that's why I'm glad we're having this discussion here, because ultimately we want to bring forward a motion that is passable and that we mostly support, so that it works for everybody, and that's my goal. Great.
Member Loeffler-Kemp, do you want to give some feedback?
Yeah, I just, I had actually appreciated Mr. Swirsky getting that information. I had sent him an email asking some of the questions about how many employees and that, so thank you for that. How many of these positions are not filled or have not been filled in the last year or two?
Well, that's a Oh, you're talking about on the list, on the total list?
Yeah, on the list. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there are some positions that we don't take them off the list in case they come back, but there are a number. I would have to take a good look around and talk to Community Ed too about some of the ones that they use. Most, I would say at least 2/3 of them though are still used in some manner.
Okay, thank you, and thanks again for sending that earlier email.
Member Harla.
I just have a question for Member Oswald. You had said that you wanted this to take place within the next fiscal year. So knowing that this conversation is continuing forward, are you looking to resolve it at the end of this month or throughout, making sure to do that? I don't want to come to the meeting next week and have to decide then if we don't have that information. I don't feel comfortable with that.
Well, if we continue this conversation beyond that, you wouldn't be part of that conversation.
That's what I'm. Yeah, so that's what I'm saying.
That's where I'm weighing. Is this something that yes, we want to continue? If we can't come to something that we can make happen within the next week here, yes, I have to look forward to continuing that conversation with a new board. Just knowing that the people that are left here, if we all support what's moving forward, that makes it worth it. So,
I just wanted to check on that. I don't feel comfortable with that with a last minute decision with those things, but if it's continuing, I would support it with the next iteration of the board.
Well, it's been a month, and so we've been working on it for a month, and it's not.
I understand, but I also thought there would be a lot more information brought forward for this time about it. So I guess that kind of falls back on all of it too. That it's nice to hear that you have other ideas and potential, so it's good to have that continued discussion.
I think that it would be helpful to have something in writing in advance for the next HR committee in January, saying here's what the motion is going to be, and here's how many people are going to be affected, and here's the fiscal impact of that, and here's precisely who's going to be impacted, and we've decided to cap it at X percent because then we're not bumping up against the next lowest paid, or we are going to apply this to all hourly workers. Whatever it is, I would like to see it concrete in writing before voting. And
May I respond?
Yeah,
oh, sure. And I appreciate that. And the reason why it hasn't is because I knew there was some flexibility here. That I want this to be a board decision, not a me decision. So, and I like I said, I didn't know. Would a cap be appropriate or would not? And obviously, I think, from what you've said anyway, a cap would be appropriate. And so I can write that, yes, and we can work together and get that done. And so the guidance is helpful because it's work and how do we get it passed, so together.
So my perspective would be it would apply to everybody regardless if they switch positions in the district. I think that anybody who stays within the district should be included in this. And depending on the financial impact, I would maybe apply to all hourly, not just minimum wage. And maybe it's a step, maybe it's full 1% to the minimum wage, but it's 0.5% to everybody else, something like that, so that you're not then bumping up. That's just my perspective on this.
Thank you for the feedback.
All right. Yes, go ahead.
So just 2 points to clarify. Not all the sub-positions have sub after them in the title. All of the paraprofessional positions are sub-positions. Okay? And it would be that way for many others. So just so that we are understanding what a sub-position is, just because it doesn't have sub doesn't mean it's a sub. Most of these positions that you're seeing truly are a sub and or could be an hourly. So a lot of them are subs. Everyone that's in that paraprofessional section is a sub.
Could we then get a list, or could you provide Member Oswald a list of just the hourly?
Yep, I think we can.
Okay. Employees.
And the other item that I would just bring to your attention is a definition of anniversary date. As subs, we send out cards every year, and individuals tell us whether or not they want to work the next year. We have individuals who will work 1 year, not work for a year or two, then on a third year call us and say, hey, I want to sub again. Can you get me connected because something has changed? So an anniversary date, if we're going to use an anniversary date, would be very good to have defined what is an anniversary date. Otherwise, it will make it a nightmare to try to administer.
All right. Got that, Member Oswald?
I do. If I can follow up, even para subs, are they covered under the contract for paras?
No, the PELRA rules have a specific 35% time, and under the para, that's anybody that is over 12.5 hours is in the para union. Anybody that's less than that is considered a sub.
Okay. And it was those funny things about subbing is why I excluded subs in the first place, but yeah, we can figure this out, I'm sure.
Member Loeffler-Kemp?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask both of you, are there any other issues we should be considering as we think about this, maybe related to contracts? And then secondly, is there any other issues around administrating this that you're concerned about?
Well, right now, I mean, we're in the midst of negotiating with both the paras, clericals, numbers. We have a contract before you, actually a tentative agreement to discuss with you tonight. You know, some of those changes, a concern could be is anything that's deemed, and I'm going to use this loosely, lucrative for the subs, and that they're going to be asking why not us also.
And just to clarify, I think we've excluded the subs from Member Oswald's proposal.
Yeah. Well,
so is that a concern still?
Still the other groups, yep.
Okay. All right. Well, appreciation for continuing to work on that with Member Oswald and to draft something that would be doable.
I just have a process question for the meeting. Since we tabled this until this month, will we have to vote to table it again? This discussion? Or?
Probably. I think yes.
Yeah. I that's my feeling, but I
yes.
No. So
consensus is yes.
We'll make that happen then, won't we, Chair? Thank you.
Okay. We can make it happen. Great. All right, Mr. Swirsky, tell us about the tentative bargaining agreement.
Okay. It was actually, we put it out here as a placeholder, and then probably about an hour or two ago, we got back together and reached this tentative agreement with the non-certified business unit. It is basically, there's some language issues that do not have dollars tied to them. Things like job advertisements. They did come up with a definition that they didn't have before of how they want to determine seniority and ties in seniority. Inclement weather and the weather closings and the 2-hour late start, so we have that language in there. And they've always had language in for a sick leave bank, but they've never funded it before, and so they would like to activate that. And then new language on the healthcare savings plan that just takes off the minimum wage, minimum age for being eligible for that. So we tied that back into the state language. They're looking at a 3-year contract with the rates of 1, 1.5, and 2.
Will you be able to provide us a redlined version of this?
You will have a redline copy most likely by Friday.
Thank you for that. Superintendent?
Sorry. I'm wondering, how are they funding the startup of the sick bank?
It's actually, they don't have to start it up. They had many years ago when the non-certified split off from, I'm trying to think what the other part was, that maybe it split in two. And they split what they had in the bank at that time, so they do have a balance in there. And then all future balances are going to come out of their own sick time where they donate their sick days into the sick bank.
Member Welty.
Yeah, Mr. Swirsky, non-certified business unit, about how large a unit is this? And the categories of, what are the general employee work units? Or what are they generally?
So it's about 20 members, and the titles range from things like an accountant, our field support technicians, business service liaison, supervisor of maintenance and custodian, food service area field supervisors, our technology people, our systems engineers, desktop engineers, network, etc. So those are the groups.
Would you guess about half of them would be right here in Hoax?
I'd guess that most of them would probably be right here in Hoax.
Okay, even the ones that have a primary responsibility at other sites?
Yeah, the field technicians work out of IT. So the field technicians that are going out, and then for food service, their area supervisors, same thing. They work out of here and then go out to sites.
Member Lofler-Kemp.
I was going to ask that just to confirm how many members were in that unit. So, thank you.
All right. Seeing no further questions on that one, Mr. Swartzky, you had a placeholder for position changes. Are we going to address that this month?
Yeah.
Yeah.
As you'll probably be discussing a little bit more in the business committee meeting, there may need to be some changes made on a financial purpose. And if there are going to be some changes made on that, we would have to give 30-day notices to individuals. And this is a placeholder for that. That would.
Say a little bit more about that. 30-day notices for what? That we're going to change somebody's position beginning in January? Or?
Beginning, yeah, second semester.
Okay.
So.
Are you leaving us in suspense for the business meeting as to what these are, or?
These might be position moves that may be necessitated by financial matters.
Okay. Member Welty?
But this will be explained to us in full in the business committee session, because I can wait if that's the case.
I don't think we're prepared today to come forward with a recommendation, but that is something that we're continuing to evaluate, and it's a potential need that may exist.
So at this point, it's a big maybe, or is it an almost certain to happen at some level or other?
At this point, I would say it's a potential that we need to allow that placeholder to take action on it if necessary. I don't want to deal with semantics of highly likely, somewhat likely. It's a potential we need to provide.
I just have the sense that maybe this is something that has already gone out to some of the buildings and been discussed based upon a rumor that got to me. So if that's the case, it seems like maybe we should have a fuller discussion of this. But I assume you're assuming this is not a done deal, and because it's not a done deal, you're treading as carefully as you are currently, describing what this might be.
Number one, I'm not aware of anything that's gone to buildings, and we are continuing to evaluate our financial circumstances to make sure that we have a full understanding of it, and any recommendations that we would come forward with, we want to provide a basis for why there needs to be a change, and we're not prepared to do that tonight.
So to clarify, Mr. Swirsky, if you fill this placeholder with any position changes before next week, we would have the information in the business committee or not, or sometime before we vote related to position changes, we will have the information, whatever proposals.
Most likely receive, there would be a resolution in there and you'd receive the information from me. I would make sure the board has it before the meeting, or an understanding of what we're asking.
What the proposal may be.
Yep.
All right. Superintendent?
I'm just going to say a little bit more. I think we'll find out in the business committee during the audit, but it's not news that our expenses in some areas were higher than we expected and our revenues were lower than we expected in some areas. And that created a deficit for last year. And we have to assume that those expenses are moving forward. And so we're trying to find some ways to save money, to make some reductions in this current year so that we end up with a positive balance. That's something that we've been working on, but we don't have the whole picture done quite yet.
Are those conversations going to be happening with staff before we are having a public discussion about them?
Yes.
Okay. Any other questions? Member Johnston.
So I'm assuming here by a week's time we will know this because we're going to have the truth and taxation thing next week too. So are we prepared to have that in that discussion? I'm assuming it has something to do with, again, deficits, expenses higher than we thought. So I'm not
sure I understand your question.
Okay, well, we're going to have a truth in taxation, which generally we have information about the financial state of our school, as well as just more than just one spreadsheet. So I'm assuming that the financial state of our school, this discussion does involve the financial state of our school, I'm hearing. So I'm asking whether or not that's going to be presented to the public next week and us.
Does this fall within the scope of the truth and taxation hearing?
I'm not sure that it does. That's something that we can evaluate. I mean, the truth and taxation is a required meeting process that we have to complete before the end of the year. So that's a discussion we will have.
But the truth and taxation is not related to general education funding. Is that correct?
It's really specific to our tax levy.
Yeah. So it may not. These position changes may not have anything to do with the levy.
In the past, we've always had pie charts where everything is broken up. All our expenses are broken down, so I think most certainly that would be included. It would have been in the past if we would have had any major change. So yes, I think it would be. I would expect that anyway. If we're going to have a change, I would expect to be certainly told next week, either in the truth and taxation pie charts or part of the business committee meeting. And so
Mr. Swirsky has assured us that we will get it in writing before the meeting on Tuesday if we are to act on it on Tuesday. All right. There is an informational item, the pay equity report.
Yeah, the pay equity report is a report we do for the state every 3 years. It primarily compares comparable salaries between male and female employees. And so that is due at the end of January. I'm just kind of giving you a heads up now. At some time, probably at the January board meeting, and even before that, you'll get the report that we print out, and it has to be approved by the board at the January meeting, and then we submit that into the state. Typically, due to the number of females we have in the Duluth School District as employees, we've not really realized any issues of substantial differences between salaries. So,
I'm glad to hear that. Member Loeffler-Kemp.
Because we'll have some new board members, would you be able to provide the report from 3 years ago when you give us information, just so
Sure.
our new board members have something to compare it with?
Sure.
Okay,
Yep.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. All right. That is it. There's no future items for the HR committee at this time, although the pay equity report will be our future item. So with that, I will turn it over to the business committee chair.
All right, we will get started.
Member Harlett, since this is a very important financial report given to us, and given the complexities of understanding our finances, I see Member-elect Gorham sitting back there. Would he be able to come join us at the table so he can start learning about all of these kinds of things?
Sure. Josh. You're welcome to join us. Well, welcome, and always good to see you again. And so we'll let you pass that out, and we'll kind of get settled. And actually, Mr. Hassler, if you want to tee up the presentation while she's passing things around, that would be great. Thanks.
We have Deb Medlin from Wipfli here with us today, and as you are aware, we have completed the process of conducting the financial audit of fiscal year 2017. As has been the case in recent years, that audit has been conducted by Wipfli. And Deb, I believe, has handed out a presentation document that she's going to be reviewing with us here tonight. So at this point, I'll hand the discussion over to Deb.
And we'll let Deb complete her full presentation, and then we'll ask questions after. So, thanks.
Thank you. I'm not used to talking into a microphone. So I know that Jody and Peggy had mailed to you in your packets bound copies of the district prepared financial statement along with our auditor's opinion. You were also mailed the gray bound was the report on the CFA, the Schedule of Federal Awards, and our opinions on that. And then you were also mailed a separate communication letter. So I've tried to take those three documents and summarize it into the handout. A little easier to go through pages rather than have you flipping through several documents. So I'll get started here. So the first page, just an introduction to the audit team. Both Jen and I have been on this audit as long as we've been doing it. So we have continued staff there, and then we have a couple of new people, Tim, Dave, and Zach. So between Jen and I, we have quite a bit of experience. Page 3, the auditor's responsibility. So our responsibility was to issue an opinion on the district's basic financial statements. We were required to report on compliance and internal controls over financial reporting. Required to report on compliance and internal controls over the federal programs, and that's in accordance with the new uniform guidance. I think this is the second year for those new OMB standards. And we're required to report on compliance with Minnesota state statutes as determined by the state auditor's office. So on page 4, the results of all of that. We issued an unmodified opinion on the basic financial statements, and so that's the best type of opinion that we could issue, and basically it says that the financial statements of the district for the year ended June 30th, 2017 were fairly stated in all material respects. On our report over internal control and compliance for financial reporting, here's where we would report internal control issues that we ran into during our gathering information and understanding the controls over financial transactions and the preparation of the financial statements, and we had no findings to report. Our report on compliance and internal controls over the federal programs, again, we had no findings, and if you looked at the CFA, you would see the dollar amount of the federal programs and the items that were tested for major programs. So we're required to test a certain percentage. You can tell the programs that were tested, and we had no issues. Also, no non-compliance with Minnesota statutes tested. So the state auditor actually issues a legal compliance audit guide. We're testing the district's compliance with 7 areas: cash and investments, conflicts of interest, bids, disbursements, compliance with UFARs and other miscellaneous statutes. And we, for the items that we did test, we found nothing that was out of compliance. So that this page is a good report. So thanks to the staff and to the board for monitoring and having those controls in place. On page 5, so our Again, under auditor responsibility, now we're getting into the communication letter, which is the separate letter that was issued. Very required specific things to communicate to a board charged with governance, which is you. So our audit was conducted in accordance with generally accepted auditing standards. That would go to the basic opinion on the financial statements. Government auditing standards, which would require the report on internal control and compliance over financial reporting, and uniform guidance, and that went to the report on internal control and compliance over federal programs. Our plan, scope, and timing was communicated at various times throughout the audit. We held an entrance conference with staff, and I believe a board member was there, and we communicate our planned procedures throughout the audit period. Significant accounting policies that were used to prepare the financial statements. Those are described in Note 1 of the financial statements, and that's your blue document. And I would just say, if you were going to really go through that document and read it and review it, I would start with the notes, and that will give you an understanding of the accounting principles. It will give you definitions for various items that are presented in the financial statements and a little more detail to understand what the numbers and the statements mean. Any unusual transactions, there were none this year. New standards, we implemented GASB 82, which really affected some terminology in the standard that applies to the net pension liability. So if you remember last year, we had a huge implementation for the PARA and TRA plans, and that just changed some terminology in that. There were no effect to the valuation of the pensions. On page 6, management judgment and estimates, lots of estimates throughout the financial statements. We believe that they're all reasonably supported. The largest estimates would be the useful lives of capital assets, the OPEB and severance liabilities, and the net pension liability. There were no audit adjustments, and we had no uncorrected misstatements at the end of the year. So again, I'll commend staff, no audit adjustments, and if we had, that would have been a significant deficiency or a material weakness in internal control. So we had none, and again, good job. Page 7, the disclosures in the financial statements are accurate, clear, and complete. There is no other information, well, we do have other information contained in the document, and that's the supplementary information. And if you read the auditor's opinion, the detail in the supplemental information is, we're not giving an opinion on every line, we're giving an opinion in connection with the basic financial statements. We had no disagreements with management. We're not aware that you consulted any other accountants. We discussed no major issues. There were no issues other than normal planning issues. And on page 8, difficulties encountered in performing the audit, we had none. Management was cooperative and helpful. Records are available and in good condition. And again, a thank you to Doug, Peggy, Robin, and the rest of the staff. They're cooperative as usual, and information is provided in a timely basis. So now getting into some financial information. On page 9, we've given you a chart of student enrollment going back to 2013. The first line would be the residents that live in Duluth that are not served by the Duluth schools. Then the red and the blue would be residents and non-residents that the school district is serving. So you can see the non-residents served, that number continues to grow, and at the end of the year was 2,508 students. The non-residents served and the residents served, those numbers continue to decline, and they totaled $8,064 this year. On page 10, we really take the non-residents served and the residents served and just give you a little more detail in the classes. So kindergarten, pre-K, 1 through 6, 7 through 8, 9 through 12. So I'm not going to go through any of those numbers, but you can see the changes in those categories. On page 11, again, a historical view of the general fund expenditures per ADM back to 2013. That is the first line, the red. And then we tell you what the statewide average is. And if you look, you'll see there's a 0 in 2017, and that's because at this point not all the districts had reported, and so we don't have that information. So if we look for 2016 and see that the statewide average was $11,279, the district's expenditures were $11,585, and those rose this year to $12,373. In those expenditures, we exclude capital expenditures because those are always very variable by district. So the types of expenditures and the rest of you can probably know in a little more detail, but I will just point out that I think that special education and transportation is very unique to every district, and that will drive some of the differences in any district between the state average. On page 12, we take that general fund expenditure information and present it again back to 2013, and just kind of a breakout of the types of expenditures that we have. And of course, it's no surprise that salaries and benefits are the largest expenditures of the district. So going on to page 13, we'll get into some results of operation and ending fund balances. So for the general fund, here we're presenting the final budget, the final actual amounts, and then the variance over or under budget. So revenues, final budget was $105,399,882. Your final revenues were $101,957,615. So in the case of revenues, you were under budget by $3,442,267. Some of the reasons for those variances was a formula change in special education and a reduction in enrollment that was less than budget. Expenditures budget $107,551,602. Actual expenditures $104,943,846. So here you were underspent from budget by $2,607,756. You had a small amount of other financing revenue, $1,001 for a sale of a capital asset. So in the budget column, you had actually budgeted to have expenditures exceed revenue and other sources by $2,150,719. In actuality, your expenditures exceeded your revenues by $2,985,230. Our beginning fund balance was a little over $3 million, and we ended up with a total of $111,418. And the next page, on page 14, is taking that $111,418 and breaking it down by the categories of fund balance. So you have a couple of non-spendable in your inventory and prepayments. So these are items that the money was spent prior to year end, but it will benefit fiscal 18. So in inventory, we had $65,202, and in prepayments, we had $63,207. Then we have three categories of revenue that are restricted by MDE. Teacher development ended the year at $100,800. We have a restricted for ALC of $188,791, and we have a restricted for long-term facilities maintenance of $179,282. So then looking at the unassigned or available to spend, in this case it's a deficit of $485,864. So the unassigned deficit is of concern. There is state legislature that requires fund balance to be above a negative, and when that negative exceeds 2.5% of your expenditures, you're in statutory operating debt, and MDE will step in at that point, probably requiring a plan to get out of the negative. So looking at your expenditures at 2.5, you a little over $2 million more in deficit, and you will be in SOD. So, not sure what your fiscal 18 budget looks like, but I think it is budgeted for a deficit, so that could be a concern. Next page, 15, the page number got cut off, but here is a look back, historical look back through 2013 of the unassigned fund balance. So you can see, we've gone into a deficit. Page 16, taking that unassigned fund balance and presenting it as a percentage of expenditures. And you can see historically back to 2013 that unassigned has been low, and now we are at a negative situation. Going on to the other funds of the district, we have the food service fund. Just looking at some totals here for net change in fund balance. Here you had planned expenditures to exceed revenue by $396,597. The final numbers showed that revenue exceeded expenditures by $677. So you ended the year at $902,048. All of that is restricted for food service. We have a couple of non-spendable categories in inventory and prepayments, and then the balance is just restricted for food service. Page 18, the Community Service Fund. And so in the budget column here, you had budgeted expenditures to exceed revenue by $187,682. Actual expenditures exceeded revenue by $40,728, and we ended with a total fund balance of $1,287,862. Here again, all of this fund balance is restricted for community service, small amount in prepayments, and then you can read the categories of restriction for the community ed. Page 19, debt service. In the budget column, we had revenues budgeted to exceed revenue by $7,835,602. Then we had some budget for a refunding issue of $6,237,957, ending with a planned deficit of $1,597,645. In the final column, revenues exceeded expenditures by $1,975,091. We had some proceeds from loans and payments from escrow and premium on the debt that was issued. Some of that was unbudgeted for, but that totaled $85,604,260. So we add that to the beginning fund balance. We ended here at $138,597,855. Again, this is all restricted for future debt service payments. $132 million is in the category of bond refunding. So most of that, the bond proceeds were to refund an existing bond issue in the future. So if you looked on the balance sheet, we'd have it sitting in cash, it's sitting in liabilities. And so that escrow account will be used at crossover to pay off the old debt. The Capital Projects Fund, here, no revenue budgeted. You had expenditures of $2,069,920. In actuality, we spent $3,128,481 more than revenue. And here we really just used up this fund. This was the old red plan fund. So we're down to $187, and essentially that fund is done with now. And that's it. So contact information if you have any questions after this meeting. Jen and I are always happy to answer those questions, and now I'm ready to answer your questions.
Mr. Hassler or Superintendent, do either of you have comments prior to discussion with the board? I want to thank you for your presentation and for your hard work. We'll start out with that. So appreciate that. And to the staff, too, that have worked really hard on this process. I know it takes a lot to do the audit. So thank you for your work and appreciate that process. So we'll dig into questions, but we'll start out with appreciation. Member Welty.
Thank you, Chair Harlan. Ms. Midland, thank you very much for the presentation. I've gone through 4 of these now. Somehow it seems like this is clearer, and I don't know if that's because it's finally beginning to sink in, or if there's if GASB has required you to make slight alterations. At any rate, I'd like to start out with my major concern, which is nothing that you can do anything about, but you can give us perhaps some perspective, and this might be helpful to the new board members that take office in January. Page 19. Looking at the debt service fund, of course, you are mostly interested in the general fund, which we're having some difficulties with, and the new board is going to have some challenges trying to keep out of statutory operating debt. Up there it mentions revenues for the debt service fund, $20 million, almost $21 million, $20,848,000. The expenditures, however, for this last year were close to $30 million, $28 million. That left us with a deficiency of almost $8 million, $7.8 million. Now, I believe in previous presentations you've indicated that you do accounting for a number of other school districts. And I'm wondering if you can give us any sense if other school districts have anything comparable to the Duluth situation where almost a third of their debt servicing has to come out of some place other than the levies. It comes out of the general fund, for instance. How unusual is our situation compared to other school districts in your experience?
If I understand what you're asking, I don't know that I have any other districts where debt service revenues come from anything other than the levy or earnings on the investments.
Well, that is, I think, the primary reason that we're having a great deal of difficulty, and it's something that there's no easy solution to. If I could ask you to go back to page 13, that would be my other question, and that has to do with difficulties we've encountered this year with some loss of revenues other than to the debt servicing fund. It's about $3 million, leaving us with a fund balance of $111,000, which is a few days' worth of expenses. You have two primary explanations for the revenues being less. One was formula changes in special education and a reduction in the enrollment. And you don't divide the two of them up. So we have about $3 million that we've gone down. Could you give me an estimate as to what percentage of that $3 million expenses we had not anticipated came from the special education funding formula changes, and which part comes from a reduction in the enrollment that comes to ISD 709?
I do not have that detail with me.
Is that something, Mr. Hassler, you would be able to define for us?
That is something I can provide you. I don't have reference to those figures at this moment.
If we could, perhaps by next week, that would be very good. Or if you can email it to us, I would appreciate that. Those are my questions for the time being. Thank you.
Thank you. Member Oswald.
I believe Member Sandstead was before me.
Member Sandstead.
Thank you. Also appreciation to your staff at Whipley and to our staff here at the district for all the work that went into this. I have the same question as Member Welty regarding the breakdown of that $3.4 million on page 13. I also was wondering if we could get the numbers on the difference between what we budgeted for enrollment and what the actual enrollment figures were that resulted in that gap. And then I had just kind of a general question about, so our general fund is separate from our reserves. And so ideally, how much money should we have left in the general fund at the end of the year? Don't we want to sort of spend what we budget? And that's just a general question for you.
Various opinions about what unassigned fund balance should be. The state auditor, I believe, would have you anywhere from 30% to 50% of your expenditures. So if you're looking at $104 million, anywhere from $30 million to $50 million. Now, you're a little bit different in a school, so that would kind of cover a city where you only get levy payments 2 times a year. So really what you need your money sitting in a fund balance for is to pay bills. So you're not a business. You don't have revenue coming in every month. I would say the very minimum that you need in unassigned would be 1 month's worth of expenditures, so 1/9 of the $104 million. And that would be just to pay payroll and expenditures before you received a monthly payment of state aids or levy payments.
Thank you. Now, Member Oswald.
Thank you. Back to page 19 that Member Welty was on. I don't know if this is a question necessarily for you or Mr. Hassler, but I'm just curious why $11.5 million premium on the bonds was not anticipated in our budget.
You can't tell until you go to market. That's a determination about what the interest rate is at the time that the bonds are let. Somebody's willing to pay a premium to buy those bonds and to sell them out to the public. That's an unknown.
Is it completely unknown to not budget something for it? Because there was nothing budgeted for it. So were we expecting to be able to have to pay a premium? Or is it just something that, it just came up?
Mr. Hassler.
I can't speak with specific knowledge of the timing, but it's not necessarily the case that you're going to start out a budget year and have full understanding that you're going to do a refunding over the course of that year. You might be working towards that, but I don't know at the start of fiscal year 17 whether or not you as a as the administration or the board had a full understanding that, oh, by golly, we have an opportunity to do a refunding, and we're going to do a refunding, and projecting interest cost savings and whether or not a premium would be paid. So I don't think it's highly unusual that you would start out a budget year without having full understanding of whether or not you're going to do refunding and what the positive ramifications of doing a refunding would be.
And do we anticipate having more premiums to pay this coming year? For this fiscal year?
Let me make sure you understand.
Yep.
Premium is a good thing. Premium is when you're going out to sell bonds and you have a principal amount, and let me just make up a number. Let's say you're selling bonds for $10 million. And in the normal course of events, what you're planning for is you're going to sell $10 million worth of bonds, and the purchaser will pay you $10 million. When you have a premium, that means they come back and say, we're going to give you, again, a made-up number, we're going to give you $11 million for the opportunity to purchase that $10 million worth of bonds. So that's a bond premium is positive to us as the issuer. It'd be a great thing if that happened every time we had a bond issue. But as Deb was indicating, that's not something that we as an issuer have control over. That's something that the market ultimately determines whether or not the interest rates that are structured in the bonds are appropriate for a purchaser to pay a premium or not.
I was just curious if we could count on some income.
What's that?
I was just curious if we could count on some income, that's all.
Well, that'd be a great thing, but it's all based on the issuance of new bonds. And at the moment, I can't say that we have an expectation of taking on any bond issues in the upcoming year.
Member Johnston.
Thank you. A question on page 9, which is the enrollment. I noticed that the non-residents served has changed. Compared to last year, the numbers are up around 300 and 350. Now they're down around 150 or 175 for this year. For example, last year it says 166, but last year, your report from last year indicates there was 342. Just wondering, was there a different way to count the non-residents served? The total number seems to be the same, at least the ones I've spot checked, but it seems like numbers were pulled from non-residents served, putting into residents served. Just wondering if you had any idea why quite a large change.
I can't explain it. I don't know. I don't know. Somebody looked at it different and pulled the numbers from someplace different. In total, the numbers are the same.
Okay. Did you guys make that? Did the
administration we put this together, not administration here. So.
Okay.
Superintendent.
I had a question on the same page, page 9. The residents not served, do you know if that includes the private kindergartens that have opened?
That I don't know.
Okay.
That we just take this off of a report from MDE.
Yeah. That's
so
then it's okay.
Kind of an important number is.
Member Johnston, one sec. You're continuing your questioning?
Pardon?
You're continuing your questions?
Yeah.
Okay, you may ask your question.
It's kind of an important number because there's been always discussion on how many kids are we bringing in versus how many kids are going out, and it's that big a change, almost double, or half, I should say. Right.
Was there a question with that? Or just a comment? I was just tracking. I'm tracking the.
I do have another question on another page.
Okay, I was waiting to see the question.
Wants to talk about that. Oh,
Member Oswald keeps asking questions. What is?
Oh, I was just asking him. I was just clarifying to Member Johnston that I would just want to know which one's right. Last year's audit that has the double number of non-residents served, or this one. That's all.
Mr. Hassler, is that information you can follow up with us on?
I'm happy to follow up on it through our own resources, and I might tap Deb and the folks at Whipfleet to see from their own records whether they can replicate why it was that last year's number was something and this year's report reflects something different. So we'll try to get to the bottom of that.
Good catch, Member Johnston. Thank you for that. Your next question.
Just one more comment on that. I know MD sends out a sheet that's fairly complex. I know I asked Tom Melcher directly once to add up all the numbers and how all the spreadsheets added up, and he couldn't even do it, so I'm assuming there is some confusion over how it's counted. But anyway, maybe they figured it out now. I don't know. I doubt it. I do have a question on, let's see, page, oops. On page, let's see, there's not a number on, but it's page 15, which is the general fund unassigned bills. Oh, am I going years here? Oh, okay. Sorry, here I'm mixing up last year's or this year's. So. I just had a question. I noticed that last year on this page, the 215 and the 216, the 215 one was 1,696,987, but this year it's listed as 3,695,052. It's over twice as higher as it was last year. Just wondering if you could explain why that was changed. The other years seem to be the same, and so I'm just wondering why that's a large difference from last year's report you gave us.
Yeah, I can explain that. I think last year when I was here, the number for 2015 had not been changed, and we had a prior period adjustment, so we just hadn't changed. We corrected that and resubmitted these reports, so you just have an old report. Last year we had an error in a prior period amount, and we corrected the beginning fund balance. So these numbers are correct. I probably checked this page 3 times, so I know they're right.
Okay. Thank you, Deb.
Just appreciate in the future when there are corrections like this, so we be given significant corrections of over whatever that is, $1.6 million correction. I would appreciate we would be given an update.
Thank you. Superintendent?
I just want to say we do give you the corrections, but I think we need to maybe collect the incorrect reports when we do that, or have you make sure that you get rid of them so you know which one's most up to date.
Thank you. Member Leffler-Kemp.
Yeah, I just have a couple general questions. Some of the other board members had made some comparisons with other districts, and it got me thinking, how does our just accounting practices, I guess, and policies compare to other school districts, and do you have any recommendations for us?
Well, no, I have no recommendations, and I think if we go back to the page where we talked about the results and no findings for financial statements, that would mean that, again, you have good internal control processes over your transactions and the preparation of the financial statement. There were no findings for the federal programs. That's extremely important, and we test those based on the OMB, the federal OMB's compliance audit guide. So there's very specific things that we're testing for in each major program for administration of that program, as well as the internal controls, and we had no findings there. And then having no findings for the compliance with Minnesota statutes. I mean, it's the best report, and so it's hard when you have a good report to give recommendations, because everything that you are doing that we looked at seemed to be working well. And so the caveat is we don't look at everything, and so there could be significant deficiencies or material weaknesses that we did not identify. But we're looking at all major classifications of transactions. We're looking at revenues, expenditures, again, items that would be in compliance with the federal programs, internal control over preparation of the financial statements, understanding the note disclosures, et cetera. And so it was a good report.
Thank you for reaffirming that. And I know you've shared that in the past as well as the great work of our staff in helping you. So thank you again.
I just have a question before going to board members asking again. It's kind of it's 4 questions in one. So I keep thinking about, there were some. I'm just going to ask them. So what can we control with where we're at, and what can we do about what we can control? What can't we control with how this budget happened, and what can we do about that? This is not a good state to be in, and what's the plan for moving forward? So I'd like to hear from administration on that.
I'm not sure I followed the 4 questions, but I think I know where you're headed.
So what is within, what are we able to handle within our budget? Are there unplanned expenses that have come in, and what are we doing about both sides of those?
I think it's important to go over that, and it's also important to see that our actuals came in under our budget by I think it was almost $2 million. Because we did make adjustments last year when we saw that enrollments were not as high as projected. There was a trend that we didn't expect, and that was keeping 5-year-olds at home or not going to school when they turn 5. And we've heard that from a number of sources. When I had the citywide PTA group here, even some of the parents that were in that group said they felt a lot of pressure not to send their kids to school, that it was social media, it was here and there. But we had 120 students just in kindergarten that didn't show up that we expected. And so that was a large chunk, and we did make some adjustments to that. But overall, our enrollment was a bit lower than we projected. And another piece that we didn't know was happening was the cross-subsidy with special education. There was a legislative change in the special education formula, and that set... It was setting a baseline on 1 year, and it just so happened that the year that they set the baseline, our tuition adjustment, which had historically been in the 150 to 200 range positive, was suddenly 1.1 million negative, and that was due to an increase in spending, specifically with Edison charter schools. And so our base was set over $1 million below what it would have been if their spending had been the same as it was historically. And that base is now what we build upon in the future. So for the foreseeable future, our revenues in special education are over $1 million lower than they had been the prior years. And so that is one of the biggest chunks that you see in this difference, and that does come out of the reserve. So and I'm using round numbers here, that about $1.2 million difference in that 1 year is something that we couldn't have planned for. We didn't see coming. We don't know those figures until after the fact. And so we are working with other school districts and legislators to really dig into this new special education formula and how it's affecting districts all over the state. I know Minneapolis, St. Paul, St. Cloud, Rochester, Elk River have all experienced very similar situations where they have already reached the cap, but yet charter school spending has gone beyond that cap, and it's taken them a bit by surprise. I know Minneapolis was in the now I can't remember the number, and I don't want to say it, but it's $20 to $30 million. So we're not quite in that range, but it is something that we are working to address to get some changes made to that. It won't change where we are right now because legislation is very seldom retroactive, but hopefully we can change what that is for the future. As far as our situation, I have been working with Mr. Hassler. We plan to bring the finance group back together, the community finance group, and our financial advisors to really set in place a short-term and a long-term plan, both to address the current situation that we're in, but to build financial stability into the future. Certainly, next month I'll be coming to you with some conversations about referendum planning into the next fall, a year from now. And I think that needs to be part of a referendum plan, would be our long-term stability. So it's just the beginning of these conversations, and we hope to come to you with a short-term plan, but also a long-term plan for stabilizing this.
I just want to be clear. So they doubled their spending within 1 year. It was we didn't know that was going to happen. I know that I've heard from staff, we've reached out to ask to be part of planning. I'm to understand that there's no response, and we are not it's like handing, like if I remember getting a credit card for the first time, and my mom, that was tied to my mom because I had a car if I needed gas. And she said, you don't just get a credit card to just spend it. We need to have conversations about it when we're looking at our family budget. So are you saying that with regard to what our community is investing in our education, we had another institution spend over $1 million of a budget without having any discussion with us?
Right. The increase,
okay, thank you.
The increase that we experienced was $1.2 million. So the increase in spending had to be more than that, but that's the portion that we are responsible for. Yes.
Yeah. And I want to be clear, that's not a conversation about the parents or the students. That is an administrative decision from that organization. So, yeah. Okay, thank you. Member Lethwickamp.
Just to follow up on that train of thought, are a lot of the decisions on spending made as part of the IEP meetings, and we're not a part of those meetings with the other school district?
Superintendent?
That's correct. We've had relationships with private and parochial schools for decades, where we share the special education responsibilities, and we are at the table at those meetings, and we do help to decide the level of services. But the statutes around charter schools do not include any of the same language, and so we are not a part of that decision making or the process of that. So we really don't know what those services are going to be or the expenses that are being planned.
Thank you. Member Johnston, your light's been on for a bit.
Sure. On that topic, I have a few other questions, but to continue on that, always concerns me when I hear the charter schools being blamed for this. I've expressed this to the superintendent. We are saying that if we had these students, that we would be spending less money. I think that's really hard for us to make that claim. We are not the ones writing the IEPs. We're not the ones involving there. While we may think that they are giving these students too much, I think that that's really hard for us to do that since we're not even there. And I think that, again, we are blaming, again, the special ed services that are going out there, and I think that is really unfair. I think another point to bring up, of course, is that if say, for example, we took these students, and we had the students in our school system, we all know everybody loses money on special ed, everybody. We don't have enough money coming from the feds or the state to cover that. So if we bring, say if charter schools weren't there and we had these students in our system, we would be losing more money than we are now on special ed. So again, I think the special ed thing is a red herring, because if we had them here, we would be losing money, maybe not as much if we would not give them as many services. That could be debated, but I think at this point I'm not going to question the social workers and the teachers and the staff that are doing that to say that these people need these services. I think it's really unfair for us to say that they're doing it wrong when the people that are benefiting are the kids that are benefiting. I don't think it's fair to blame them.
Member Jensen, my clarifying question was actually to your point. If we had the students within our system, we'd be able to plan for it. And so we're not looking at the parents, we're looking at the lines of communication with regard to that. Member Oswald, your question.
Right along that line, I'm having a hard time understanding how it's $1.2 million. Is that the amount of money between the 10% that they have to pay and the 60 whatever percent that we pay because we get the money for them because it runs through us? Or is that the total bill? It's really hard for me to understand where $1.2 million adds up, because I looked up, and I really wanted to relook up the Edison's budget, which is readily available online, and I don't recall their special education budget from last year being more than $3 million. And so in order for it to get to be $1.2 million that we're spending, they would have had to double their budget and more. And so I really would like to, maybe you could baby step me walk through how it got to be $1.2 million.
Superintendent.
I'd want to do that when I have the documents in front of me and I'm able to refer to it. We do have those, and I could go over those with you. When we first started looking at this, I too thought, how can this be? Where is this? And so we reached out to MDE and traveled down and met with Tom Melcher and Paul Farron, and I'm losing names right now, but we met with the team down there who specializes in the revenues and general ed, special ed, all things revenue, and that is where it was explained to us that this amount was new, and it was a sudden increase in their expenditures that was a surprise to MDE as well. But that's who walked us through it, and I'd be happy to share those with you. I understand. May I continue? I understand the sensitivity around the topic, and I absolutely believe that students need services. The service models that each district uses is a decision that each of those districts make. In fact, the tuition adjustments are based on a district's average program cost per hour per student. And I think that the solution to this lies within the legislation around special education funding, around state and federal funding, and around the legislation of charter schools and our relationships to each other. I think going on a model that the rest of the state uses of average cost per student may be something to explore. So.
Thank you. No further questions? Okay. Member Johnston.
Yeah, sure. I'll continue on that one. Then if I understand it, we've had a net change in the fund balance. Going back to page 13, again, we're down to 112, where we used to be 3 million. And we got the 1.2 million. You're thinking, even though I disagree with the analysis, it's assuming the 1.2 million is allotted to special ed. So where is the other 1.8 million change? Only says only other item here is that reduction in enrollment greater than expected. Is that it? We got 1.2 million in special ed, and then the rest is reduction in enrollment, or is there other numbers in that as well?
Superintendent.
There was some planned expenditures that we talked about before for curriculum, the Wonders Reading program, and so there was as we passed the referendum in excuse me, in 2013, our plan was to have a steady expenditure level, and that meant that our revenues were going to be slightly higher in the earlier years and slightly lower in the ending years, so that we could have a steady investment over the life of the referendum. Part of that was the curriculum piece, and so there was $600,000 that was planned expenditure out of that too. So that's 0.6.
Okay, it's 600,000. Okay, we're still not up to 3 million altogether, are we? 1.2. Oh, we're missing 1.2 still. Yeah. So where's the other 1.2?
Do you want to take this, Doug? That is
the other component is the general education revenue being less than was anticipated based on a projected enrollment.
Okay, so it's all enrollment then, the 600,000 plus special ed and the rest. That comes out to how much? 1.2 million, and due to that. This is sidetrack a little bit. I recall once, since Mr. LeBlanc is at our table here, we had some spreadsheet projections. Don't remember what those were, but I don't know, maybe you remember, Jody, but I think now we're up a few years beyond those projections, and I don't recall, but I'll go back and look at my sheet, but I think we were projecting an enormous deficit, if I recall right, at that one time. I don't remember, Welty remembers when that spreadsheet came out. But anyway, just there's some data there. Our projections or estimates haven't been real accurate. I mean, that's the nature of the beast, of course. I do have a question back to my original question on page 15. You indicated that the 2015 money was corrected. What was the nature of that correction?
We had a prior period adjustment for the way we were calculating a levy item. Okay, so did that have anything to do with the severance insurance premiums that no. that
I've been trying to find out? Okay,
no.
It had nothing to do with that. Okay. Or what about this year's? Was this year's, what are you doing with the severance insurance premiums this year?
How are we dealing with what?
I'm just going back the last 7 years. 3 of the last 7 years, the auditor put severance insurance premiums in, and 4 years they didn't. I'm just wondering what you did this year and why they were in or were not in.
You're talking about an assigned fund balance for severance payments.
That's correct.
We do not have it this year because you cannot have an assigned balance with a negative unassigned balance. You cannot create a negative with an assigned. So I believe the last 3 years that's been the issue, and we have not had any assigned for severance.
Okay, so that may happen again in the future.
Right. Well, when you had larger fund balances, we did have some assigned for severance. As those fund balances have declined, management has gotten away from the assigned. The auditors don't make the assigned fund balance. Management sets that, and that's at their prerogative annually. The only, from an audit point of view, you cannot have an assigned balance that creates a negative unassigned. And we have had those years where we have not been able to assign for severance because it would have created a negative.
Okay, well, it's up to management's prerogative. I mean, how are we, as somebody who's trying to understand something with one piece of paper, we're trying to compare apples to apples, so how do we know when management
It still goes to the
to?
Unrestricted portion. Those two when MDE looks at it, MDE looks at those $2 amounts together to look at what your unrestricted fund balance is. So.
When I talked to MD about it, they didn't have a clue why some years it was put in and some years it wasn't. It was on the books, but it wasn't put in. Other years it was on the books and it was put in. And they were very surprised why there was. Some years it was put in, and as a board member, somebody who's a lay person looking at the finances, it makes it difficult to be able to know when that money is put in and when it isn't, and why it is and why it isn't, because it does make a big difference on the bottom line. Yeah.
All I know is that MDE looks at those two lines combined when they're determining what the unrestricted fund balance is.
For the ability for continuation, should administration have questions following your term, Member Johnston, who was that at MDE you had spoken with? Maybe they could follow up to get clarification.
I'll have to look up my records on that.
Great. Member Welty.
Mr. Hessler, going back to page 13, you've already assured us you're going to be checking out the special education funding costs to figure out what portion of that $3 million decrease in the fund balance it accounts for, and then the enrollment reduction portion too. So we know which one of those or what proportion they've pulled money out of our budget. I just did a quick check, and I was just using the figures that were here, but I was trying to figure out what portion the enrollment might be. We've already had it suggested that the special education cost might be $1.2 million, which would mean that the enrollment would be $1.8 million if it was all the rest of accounted for the rest of that. So I, out of curiosity, took a look at the change in enrollment from last year to this year using the ADM figures. And I came up with 60 fewer kids times the $12,300 per kid, and it was about $740,000. So if I've used the right set of information, I probably haven't. There's still a gap between what accounts for the entire $3 million deficiency in revenues between the SPED cost formula change and the enrollment. So I'm looking forward to any explanation that you can give us as to where that loss came from next Tuesday.
Superintendent?
Member Welty, I think you missed a section of our conversation because we already discussed this.
I might very well have, so I'll have to watch it.
Okay.
or maybe somebody can inform me what I wasn't paying attention to.
That was what Member Johnston just asked, and then you re-asked. Member Johnston, and a fresh question.
I think that the question is legitimate from Mr. Welty about looking at the numbers. They don't quite jive. I'm looking at page 14, which is a fund balance. And again, look back as far as I've got on my records. We have a negative general fund balance this year. As far as I can see, for the first time since I've been on the board, at least, and probably first time ever, officially anyway. And of course that concerns me. Even though we're not up to our 2.5% to put us in official statutory operating debt. But it's, I guess the first would be a concern is MDE, I know, doesn't really come in until we hit 2.5, if I recall the statute's correct. But is this being flagged, and then are they come up and saying, what are you guys doing? Are they doing any preliminary steps to try to keep us from being into that 2.5 number?
Superintendent?
Just curious if if they're paying attention yet.
Well, as I mentioned before, we called them first and went down to meet with them to discuss our situation and how we got here. One of the first things I learned was that if the special education formula base had been set the prior year, we'd have $1.3 million in our reserves. It wasn't something that we could have seen coming. It wasn't something that we could have planned for, but it is something that we have to face now. And I've kind of gone over the plans for short and long term and how we're going to address this. But I want to point out that this isn't something that was planned or that we could have seen coming. It's something that we're reacting to. I know that having a low fund balance in prior years has been something that we've been concerned about because, I think most business people, when they look at a budget, they would consider a 1%, being off by 1% would not be unusual for any business. I think it's usually more a larger percentage than that. For us to be in the hole, because it's a 1% effect of our budget is unfortunate, but it isn't something that we could see coming. But we are putting plans in place to correct our current direction and have plans to make a long-term plan for financial stability.
Member Oswald.
Can I finish my question, please?
Yes.
Again, I'm glad we're looking at it here, but this is a long-term issue. I do believe, I don't have the numbers here, I didn't look them up, but when I got on the board 8 years ago, I believe we had a $15 million fund balance somewhere in there. It's been going down. Why not a steady decline? It's been bumping up and down, but the general decline is significant. Obviously, 15 down to a negative is not a good sign. And it certainly concerns me as a board member and as in the future, just as a taxpayer, no longer a board member. I hope that it concerns everybody in the town.
Member Oswald.
I was just asking a follow-up question that you referenced. We're working on correcting our situation now. Do we currently have a deficit that we're having to address in our recommendations that Mr. Swirsky alluded to, and how much is that? Because I mean, are we only correcting to refill some reserve fund, or are we correcting to hit zero?
Superintendent?
As Mr. Hassler said, we don't have a complete plan in place at this point. I can tell you that we are putting some projects on hold. We're putting a freeze on carryover. We're making some adjustments, reductions to non-labor budgets throughout the district, making sure that we come out on a positive side, at least where we are at the end of the year. What we have to assume is that the expenses that we weren't expecting are continuing into this year, and we didn't plan for them. And so we need to make adjustments because the special ed revenue is going to be, considerably less than what we had planned for. And so we need to make mid-year adjustments to be able to come out positive on the other side. Otherwise, we would be probably close to the SOD mark.
Can I follow up? And so I gather that you don't want to throw out a ballpark figure of what we need to make up. And so I guess it's hard to frame a question around how deep do the cuts have to go? Are they superficial? And from what you gather, from what I gather that you have said, that these are significant cuts and people aren't expecting them. So is that a fair statement to make? I don't want to put that narrative out there if it's not what it is.
I think the narrative is out there. We are trying to find ways to cut costs as far away from classrooms and classroom services as we can. If there are other things that we can put off, then we will do that. An example would be the telepresence. We had fully intended to install telepresence this year. It was about $200,000. We're putting a hold on that until we can find some other funding. I know that Member-elect Trinka sent a grant connection for us to consider for installing that, and so we're going to have to be a little creative on how we do some of those projects. But we're in the process of identifying other things in the budget that could be reductions other than staff. However, I don't think that we will be able to avoid some staff reductions. We do have some mid-year retirements. We do have some long-term sub positions. We have some other planned reductions that were happening. So we're working on it, but we're not ready to give you a solid number or all the things on that list.
I'll quit asking for a number for now.
Member Johnston?
Sure. I had a lot of questions. I'll just have one questions on the packet that we were given out. You didn't talk about it. The auditor didn't, but since she's here, if I could ask a question.
Which packet? What color is the front
page? The blue book that we received.
And what page are you looking to?
I'm looking on page 60. It says defined benefits. We're in the defined benefits plan. And specifically, my question was on page 60. I noticed that the investment rate of return changed from 8% last year down to 4.66%. There's some discussion of it on the next page as well. I also noticed that this was just on the teachers and on the I forget the other one called non-teachers is section B. Their rate was left at 8%. And could you explain, I think this is an auditor question since I believe you put this together, not us. Why did the interest rates change so much? Why was it 8%, which is obviously not reasonable, I don't think. And why is the 13B rate still up at the 7.5% rather than why was that lowered? And I think maybe if you could pull that off to the correlation at the start here where it shows the budget change or the pension issues, if I can find the right page, changed enormously. I can't find it now, but I'll get it while you're maybe starting to answer the question on the rate of return.
Okay, so the information that is presented on the defined benefit plans for PARA and TRA is information that has come from those two organizations based on their actuaries and their auditors. So we're simply restating their information. I have no determination on how they compute discount rate or what rate would be appropriate. That would be based on a set of assumptions that's put together by the plan and the actuary. And yes, the district's portion of net pension liability, which is presented in the long-term debt group on page 51, did increase substantially, as it did in every district in Minnesota. And again, that's based on your amount of contributions to the plan, what percentage of a participant you're in, what the liabilities were at year end, and your percentage of those liabilities.
So questions on that would need to be directed to PARA and TRA?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. We're simply restating their auditor information. Your percentage of that plan and your liability have been determined by the actuaries and the auditors, and we're simply including that. That information about the net pension liability has nothing to do with your governmental fund financials. Does not show up in the general fund, food service, community service, or debt service. If you understand the presentation of the financial statements, we do fund financial statements. We also present government-wide, which includes the debt and fixed assets that are not included in the fund financials, and those liabilities are included in the district-wide financials. And I never go over that information with boards because it's beyond their understanding. What you're really interested in is what did we budget to happen and what actually happened and where are our fund balances at year end. So while that is a lot of information and required disclosure for the reader, has nothing to do with your operating funds.
Thank you. Member Johnson, a brief follow-up.
Yeah, well, I disagree. As a school board member, if I think it's important, I will ask a question on it. So it is something that that is important. When I see our long-term liabilities go from 375,000 to 600, or 375 million up to 610 million in 1 year, I don't care if it's some bookkeeping an adjustment or somebody decided an interest rate was changed or not. That concerns me, because I think it should. Because I am looking at the long term and not just looking at this year. So
I agree, and I didn't mean to minimize your what you're looking at, but I'm just saying you have no control over that. Those liabilities will be paid back over the next 30 years, depending on funding sources to the plans, investment earnings of the plan, etc. So it's not really anything that you have control of. And again, yes, accounting standards require that we present that information, but I just wanted you to not be aware that it is not included in any of your operating funds.
Well, I'm well aware of that, but it does concern me in long term. I mean, somebody's going to have to pay this, and I don't know who's going to end up paying it. But if the school ends up paying it, that could be a big liability. And we look at other entities, for example, state of Illinois, who has had the large pension on liability, and I don't know what's happened on that. Maybe the Economist magazine doesn't know what they're talking about, but some people seem to think this is a big deal. When I see our thing double, I think it should be something that we as school board members and the public look at to see what's the cause of it. I guess I would say that I guess when I know you just get the numbers from TRA, but certainly 8% investment return rate going down to 4%, that I would assume that is a big cause of this. And certainly I can't imagine anybody thinking 8% is a reasonable figure. And 4% seems to me kind of high for the returns that I'm looking at and my money, and also the discrepancy between the plan, I'll call it the A portion, the teachers, and the B portion, the non-teachers. They're still at 8%. And if you look on page 68, the amount of district proportional share of the pension liability is completely dependent on what that rate is. So if they drop this down to what it should be, 4% next year, whatever the economy shows it to be, our pension liability is going to go up enormously again. And somebody says a year later, it should have been 8%. I mean, does this mean anything at all? I think there should be some account looking at what's a reasonable interest rate of return, and I don't think that's happening here. Somebody's not doing their job about having a consistent, realistic, real rate of return when we're looking at long-term liabilities.
Thank you. Member Welty, the last question, and then we need to move on with the rest of our agenda.
Probably one requires a long answer that you may not be able or inclined to provide, but I'm curious, again, having to do with our long-term debt.
Page, book?
Oh, I'm looking at page 51. There are several places that mention the certificates of participation that we are using to that we've used to pay for our long-term funding versus general obligation bonds. We're using about twice as much borrowing for certificates of participation versus general obligation bonds. I'm just wondering that if you, as an auditor, having dealt with these methods of borrowing for facilities for public entities like a school district, have any thoughts about the merits of one or the other, or problems or liabilities, or just any observations about the two forms or the two different instruments for borrowing that you could offer me, probably just for academic purposes at this point, since we can't really change this?
I really can't add to that. I think that your bond agents working with you will direct you to the type of debt that is best for you and what's allowable under statute for what you're trying to do.
Thank you. I appreciate the time that you've spent with us, Deb, today, and if members have additional questions to follow up, they can follow up with the superintendent or Mr. Hassler. Appreciate your time, and we're going to take a 3-minute break.
Could I just add one little thing?
Briefly, Superintendent.
One of the positive things for adjustments this year is that our enrollment was up higher than projections, and so that's a positive for this year.
Great. Thank you. All right, we can reconvene. All right. Members of the board, are there any questions on 1A through G? One thing I want to note, all past year's audits, all that information is available on the website. So with regard to the last discussion, all former years, all that information is available. So important for folks to know. All right, so I see no lights on 1A through G. We'll move on to, item 2, there are no bids, quotes, or RFPs. And I'll move on to policies and regulations. Member Sandstead.
Yes, I have a clarification that was raised about 8095, and I talked with Jackie, who had a great suggestion that I think it was paragraph, the first and the last paragraph.
Which page are we on?
On page 27.
Okay, great.
The proposed deletion of 8095, which was credited to me in the minutes, but I think might have been, yes, Member Loeffler-Kemp. Okay, so hopefully you agree with this, Member Loeffler-Kemp, that what we do is we delete the second, third, and fourth paragraph of 8095 and keep the first and the fifth for now, and then they're going to be folded into a different new policy that will be a first reading in January. So the proposal would be to only delete the middle paragraphs of 8095 this month.
So instead of deleting, we move to amending this resolution. They're amending this policy. So then would that bring us back to a first reading of that policy then?
It would probably be a first reading of 8095 rather than 204, and all of the other deletions can go ahead, but 8095 would continue to exist in a shorter form moving forward.
I think that makes sense. Board members, any discussion on that? Member Loeffler-Kemp?
Yeah, I thank you for bringing that up, and that was just the point I was going to make as well, based on our earlier discussions. So I would be fine with it being in a shorter policy and totally separated from this new policy.
Could I clarify?
Mr. Hassler.
So next week, are you wanting to see this policy modified as has just been described in terms of deletion of paragraphs 2, 3, and 4 with the other two paragraphs remaining as is?
Yes.
For second reading?
It would be first reading because it moves from a deletion to be a first reading.
I'm okay with that. I just thought I heard that it was going to be on second reading and then it would come back in January with a modified policy.
It is technically the second month we've read it and had discussion on it.
I would do it as a second reading, and then it would be final as just a 2-paragraph.
And then there's another step to take, which is
to delete those last 2 paragraphs when it gets incorporated into a different policy that we're not seeing, so we don't drop them.
Okay.
That they carry forward. That's what I would suggest, that it's still a second reading, but instead of of a deletion, we're amending to delete a portion. If we can do that.
Yeah, Superintendent.
I'll just make a note that I went over this with Melinda and Jackie earlier today, and they know exactly what the plan is. That was my suggestion to bridge the gap between this policy and the next policy where this one fits better. So,
thank you. Member Oswald.
I'm bringing up my concern yet another month that I would request the addition of the word bylaw in the title of policy 204, since we are deleting 2 bylaws, and I would certainly hope that accommodation can be made, because I don't want to have to vote against deleting the bylaws that would be incorporated in there.
Yeah, I thought that was a note I was checking for. All right. Any further questions on this on the second reading of these? Second reading / deletion / not second reading. Okay, great. That moves us on to item 4. Any updates with change orders, leases? Anything there? No. Resolutions, acceptance of donations. Any questions on that? All right, certified tax levy, item 5B. Mr. Hassler.
What I would touch on there is we will be conducting our truth and taxation hearing next week, and the certified tax levy resolution kind of goes hand in hand with that hearing. So that's just what I wanted to throw out there.
That's great. And we'll have that presentation. And then materials in advance of the meeting next week, too. That usually comes up. All right, thanks. Member Johnston.
Yeah, could I get a copy of the Truth and Taxation handout a couple days ahead of time?
That's what I just identified, that we'd be getting that.
When? I
just said we'd be getting our packets, correct?
That will be included in the packet.
Oh, okay. That'll be good. Thank you.
Great. Make sure we keep our listening ears on. All right. Item 5C, resolution for polling place combination. Mr. Hassler. It's a placeholder, but.
I don't have much information on that. I do know that that we've got some information on that, so that's something that we'll provide clarification on.
If it is, could we just have a brief memo with it?
Certainly.
Great, thank you. And then item 5D, the reopening of Brockridge. Mr. Hassler,
it's just a formal resolution for the board to act on that would also be provided to MDE to formalize that this building will be back in operation.
Thank you. Member Oswald.
Do you need to go first? Oh, okay. I had a question from a concerned citizen, and is this resolution anywhere tied to getting the certificate of occupancy from the city of Duluth?
Mr. Spooner?
No, it would not be.
So we don't need to worry about having that or not before passing this resolution?
Code officials are going to give us a certificate of completion, that's for the construction, and then a new certificate of occupancy since the building's been vacated. We're meeting with code officials about the 22nd that week, and I don't see any issues right now. And it's independent. This is a city code issue for the occupancy and completion versus a board action.
Thanks for letting me know.
Great. Superintendent.
Yeah, I was just going to say that this is a step that's required by the state because we had a hearing to close Rockridge, and you don't have to go through all of that process, but you do have to take an action as a board to officially reopen it. And I was just going to say that the students' first day will be Friday, January 5th. We're allowing the teachers one day, so the kids will be done one day early before the winter break to finish packing up any last items that they have. All of it will be shipped to Rockridge Academy. That will be the new name over the Christmas break, and then they will, winter break. I didn't mean to say that. And then we will have some time over break that would be available if teachers wanted to come in and work, but they have 2 days after break to come in, unpack, set up all their classrooms, because we want everything to be all ready for the kids when they come back on the 5th. And then we're hoping to have an open house later in January where we'll invite board members and the community and everybody to come in and see the newly revamped and remodeled building.
Thank you. Member Lefferkamp.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure you had mentioned that about the open house. I know in talking with my neighbors and folks in my neighborhood that they were looking forward to that as well. So thank you again for mentioning that.
Member Johnston.
Just for clarification on what Member Oswald mentioned, I'm assuming we're going to have those code certifications from the city by January 5th.
Mr. Schooner?
Yes, we will, and we have to. Otherwise, we won't be opening unless we have those. And it's important to note that the site work will not be done until spring. So when we do have the open house, the parking area and things like that, they weren't able to be done this fall yet. So those will be done this spring.
But the occupancy, certification of occupancy has to be done though for the building, right? Or does it not have to be done by January 5th?
No, the building will be done. The building, the school itself will have a certificate of occupancy or a temporary certificate of occupancy to allow the students to come back on January 5th, but that's not dependent on the site work.
Okay.
Thank you. Right, seeing no further lights, we'll move on. Any updates on sale of property? No. Informational expenditure contracts, revenue contracts. Any questions on that, members? All right. Future items, legislative agenda, and policy updates. With that, that's our business committee. Have a good night.